Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this forum. I'm David Theo Goldberg, the director of the UC Humanities Research Institute, the host organization for this. It's an enormous pleasure to welcome Philip Schmidt to talk to us today. Philip, most of you will know as the co-founder and now director of the Peer-to-Peer University. He lives in Cape Town, of all places, my hometown, so I'm thrilled to know that and knowing from that. He has worked on education and development issues in Africa. He has worked in the past for Accenture in France. He's a computer scientist by training, and has been part of the UN University Merit Program, has worked for the University of the Western Cape in Cape Town in setting up programs for them, and is involved with the MacArthur Foundation Initiative in Digital Media and Learning, along with us, deeply involved in conversations, and the Mozilla Foundation, the Firefox folks, really in designing a badging system for certifying community-based knowledge formation. And he's here to talk to us today about Peer-to-Peer University. So please join me in welcoming Philip. There will be comments on his talks by Gary Matkin, who's the Dean of Continuing Education here at UC Irvine. Gary is here, it's a great pleasure to have him here. And Bill Maurer, who's the director of the Institute for Money, Technology, and Financial Inclusion. I'm just getting it right, yeah. And a colleague of ours in Anthropology. So welcome, Phil.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here today. Thanks for inviting me, David. Because without UC Irvine, Peer-to-Peer University might still exist, but it wouldn't have gotten to where it is as quickly. And we've had a long relationship with Gary and Larry in the Opencourseware work, who's kind of helped us get started and incubated the project actually at some point, when it was just an idea that a few people had who worked all over the world and didn't quite know what was going to happen with this idea. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about kind of the context in which Peer-to-Peer University became an idea first and then went from an idea to a project. Some of the changes that are happening in the world of higher education that we are seeing, and then talk a little bit about what Peer-to-Peer University actually is and how it works and who's involved and how the courses work. And then mention a few areas that we are really interested in at the moment, including badges and certification, but almost more like questions, kind of presenting you with the thoughts that we have, and then I'm hoping that we can have a conversation about that more than me kind of just talking about Peer-to-Peer University. So I think the fundamental kind of situation is I and the people who started Peer-to-Peer University saw was that there's this amazing moment of opportunity right now in higher education, and that opportunity is a mix of three things. It brings together the formal education environment with the open web, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means in my head, and the informal learning environment. That we now have a chance to actually bring those together in a much more coherent way, leverage the strengths that the different pieces have, and really see some pretty, I think, amazing changes in how higher education is working. So I think the current model, and I mean, I've worked in a university in Cape Town where probably the situation is very different from UCI, but I do believe that there are some similarities that kind of resonate in both places. And I think that we have kind of reason to believe that there are certain things that are fundamentally wrong with the model of higher education that as we have practiced it in, let's say, the last 100 years, maybe kind of building on the Humboldt University and then the kind of more the driver of industrial development and the kind of strategic role that the university has played in workforce development, etc. And I think the reason why we're a little bit stuck is because of this concept of the iron triangle. The model that we have now, it's difficult to move any of these three pieces without affecting the other two. So if we are trying to bring down cost, it affects quality and access generally. If we try to increase access, the other two are affected. And we're kind of stuck where we're trying to make all of them more access at lower cost and higher quality, and it doesn't quite work. And I think it's for structural reasons that doesn't quite work. I think it's obvious that if we look at the demand for higher education, I mean, UC Irvine is a great example with the huge influx of foreign students. I think it's obvious that if we look at Asia and South America, the number of young people who are going to be looking for higher education opportunities in the next 10 or 20 years, there's no way that we can build enough brick and mortar universities and not even supply them with educational opportunities using distance learning, because there simply aren't enough teachers in the way that the current model works to teach all these students. I'm going to speak a little bit about the quality aspect here, which is related to learning, and then I'll come back to that later. I think cost and access are pretty self-explanatory. But so talking about the quality aspect, it's someone actually at the DML conference used this metaphor, and I thought it was quite interesting. He said, the way we think about education is like we're preparing for hibernation. Like if we're a bear who's preparing for hibernation, we try to eat as much as possible in a really short, defined period of time, and then we kind of don't eat for a really long time. So we go to university and we cram all this knowledge into our heads, and then we go out into the world. We work for 10 or 20 years, and it's disconnected, and it just I think in today's world that's just that's first of all it's changing, and second of all people are really struggling. Even if I look, I studied computer science. There's almost nothing I learned in terms of technical skills in my university experience that is still relevant today. So there are certain practices of working and collaboration and kind of, an approach to being a computer scientist that's still very valid, but a lot of the things I have to constantly upgrade. And then secondly, still in the quality or learning space, I think we know that new skills are needed. Some people call them 21st century skills, other people speak more about digital literacy. But the way we are teaching is still very much stuck in a structure where people are not encouraged to collaborate with each other. The lectures it's a very rigid lecture structure where people are expected to sit in a chair for 50 minutes and listen to someone talk largely. The situation in a place like UC Irvine might be different, where more people have access to small seminars and more interactive experiences, but that is an absolute luxury for the majority of people in higher education. So, we mustn't forget that most people, sit in row 18 of some lecture hall listening to someone speak in the front. And taking that kind of learning experience where there's a lot of new ways that people learn that is not reflected in the institution to the certification, I think the same is true for certification. We still have the same kind of degree that we've had for decades, which at best, I would argue, gives some implied statement about someone's abilities, because it is such a summary, right? So I get one piece of paper that is supposed to tell you about my at least 4-year-long experience of learning and achievements and my abilities. And the best I think we do in most cases, we kind of associate it with the brand of the university, and we just assume, okay, well, he's an Oxford man, but often we get it wrong, and the Oxford man actually is not exactly what we expected, or maybe the Oxford brand isn't. Now, it's easy to pick on a UK institution here because I'm in the US. If I was there, I would do it the other way around. But so I think that, basically, I think the certification is also still stuck in this old model. And so I think it's useful to look at what has changed. And the changes, I would argue, are dramatic, not so much in higher education, but outside of higher education, and then look at what are the opportunities that that creates. So one is content is free. The digitization of content, there's a downward push towards free that is almost impossible to resist. People have tried all kinds of business models to deal with open and free content. The reality is once it's out of the box, it's very difficult to put it back into the box. And I think the textbook publishers are the latest industry that is experiencing that at the moment. And then secondly, we've seen that people are able to self-organize in incredibly sophisticated ways to create amazing knowledge products. So Wikipedia is one example, open source software. There are many dozens of other examples in the arts, in science, where these online communities, seemingly unregulated, they actually are highly regulated, but the regulation comes from within more than is pre-designed from outside. People work together, they put in a lot of time, they put in a lot of expertise. They often outperform the incumbents, so Wikipedia quality in some areas outperforms Encyclopedia Britannica, or at least has, I think the Nature study concluded that they are equally incorrect in most fields. And so we have this, we see this incredible collaborative spirit that's happening online, and the kind of the raw materials of education, which I would say are content, are becoming free. I'm kind of going to just use two examples for that. So one is UC Irvine has an Opencourseware site. I've picked the MIT video because I wasn't sure which video Larry wanted me to show, but the amazing thing is not that this video is available online. The amazing thing is that, and this is an old screenshot, that 390,000 people have viewed this. To reach 390,000 individuals as a lecturer was impossible 10 years ago. And now, you know, uploading it to a website, there's no charge. Hundreds of thousands of people can access it. And what's interesting, I think, about these hundreds of thousands of people, they are all over the world. So this is actually from UCI's Opencourseware experience that learners from 159 countries access these materials. At the same time, 25% of the people coming to the site are from California. So you have this really interesting mix of people, very strong local interest, but also kind of diffusion, global diffusion, where there are all these people who had no way of getting these materials before, who obviously have a demand for them. And in terms of the access, so this is more, I guess, about where I live, but maybe equally applicable to other parts of the world. This was in 2010. This is in kind of forecast for 2012, and I should have taken one before, where basically there was almost nothing for everything leading up to 2010. So the amount of access, yeah, by the way, this is the internet access coming into the countries in Africa. So the amount of access is increasing so rapidly right now that very soon broadband internet access will be affordable in large parts, at least all the coastal nations of Africa. So the result of this is that we now have the world's greatest educational resources and content available free of charge online, so that everyone can reach them, and millions of other people that we could potentially learn with using those materials. So the current model is broken, is how I started. What's nice now is that everyone can actually help to fix the situation, right? So it's not just the innovation doesn't have to come from the institutions, but it can come from other places. And I think that is fundamentally the story of peer-to-peer university, where we saw there was all this content on the internet, but there was a disconnect between the content and making use of it, and turning it into learning and turning it into experiences that would help people advance in their lives, in their careers, or maybe help them get into academic opportunities that weren't available to them before. So peer-to-peer university has been around for a little more than a year. It's really kind of centered on the two pillars of open content and the open social web. So bringing people together, giving them access to content, and creating learning opportunities. It's completely free of charge. Anyone can get involved. The courses are all run by volunteers. A course in our model is usually a 6-week-long kind of set of challenges that people work through, but there's huge, I mean, if people want to do 8 weeks or 4 weeks, it's completely open to that, so there's flexibility. The learning model is fundamentally different, or at least in principle, because that could be an interesting aside actually to come back to. So the structure is really peer learning, where the role of the lecturer or professor is minimal, really more as a facilitator who helps people learn, but not someone who is the content expert. I think right now that is still more a vision than a reality, for a number of reasons. One is that people are just not used to this, right? So they kind of don't trust it. And only people who've experienced it, and often they've experienced it in great institutions like UCI, kind of have made that mental switch where they go, yeah, well, actually, I learn all these things with my fellow students, not necessarily from the professor. And so then they have the confidence to kind of take that step. But yeah, I mean, the principle is very much focused on peer learning, putting study groups together, rather than having someone teach those groups. We've got, this is kind of an, I guess, to highlight the fact that there is demand. We've done zero marketing, so it's all word of mouth and kind of people picking it up online and using Twitter and Facebook to get the word out. We have about 10,000 registered users on the site. We ran 54, I think it is, courses which started in January. More than 3,000 people signed up for them, 2,200 were accepted into them, and 1,400 enrolled. And I'm using kind of activity in week 2 as the enrollment to determine if someone actually enrolled. And we've grown every round, we've doubled so far, and so we're planning to do that at least for 1 more year, which means double the number of people and the number of courses every 3 months right now. And we also we've had courses in 3 languages. English is by far the most popular language, but there is a strong Spanish community in Latin America. There was a very strong Brazilian community that quieted down a little bit. But so yeah, courses in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. This is a kind of a special project within Peer-to-Peer University. It's a partnership with Mozilla, where we try to use the peer-to-peer model to apply it to web developer training specifically. So Peer-to-Peer University as a overall is, you can run any course that you want to run there, and I'll give 2 or 3 examples later. School of Webcraft is much more focused on one particular area. It has the strong partner in Mozilla who give content expertise, who bring a community of web developers, and who will also be certifying some of the achievements that people make in these courses. And so maybe to kind of lead into what are some of the use cases, why are people running these courses? What's the interest in Peer-to-Peer University? And as much as we know this, right, we haven't been very good at collecting data on people who come to us and what they're doing. But in the web development field, it was a very strong response that people basically said, well, there isn't really a great place to become a web developer. Like I can go on the internet and I can try to find my way and find these communities, and I can submit problems and maybe someone will help me, but there isn't really a community for people learning web development. And the alternatives that you had, where you could go to university and study computer science, where web development is a really small piece of all these other things you would be learning. And if you just want to be a web developer, you're going to learn a lot of things that you're not interested in. Or you could go into the private training fields, where often the programs are very proprietary, not in line with the open technologies that actually drive the web, which are the most innovative things like HTML5, which is the next version of HTML, which is completely open. So those things, there wasn't really a space for these people, and we've definitely had the feedback that confirmed that there was a gap, and why people are coming to School of Webcraft. Kind of 2 other examples of why people would run a course with P2PU and what they get out of it. Andrew Renz is a lawyer from South Africa. He
spent a lot of time advising people in education on licensing issues. So people had questions about I think it's fair use here, it's fair dealings in South Africa. Like how many pages can I copy? If it's under Creative Commons license, what does it mean? How do I license it? And so he was bogged down with questions, and he was one of the very few people in South Africa who had this knowledge. So he designed a course, Copyright for Educators, because he hoped that he would have to do less of the work if he could make people learn it themselves. Didn't quite turn out that way in the first iteration, but his course is actually great because it was designed very aggressively to not have an instructor. And even the last assignment is to design an assignment for the next round of courses coming in, so that he wouldn't even have to come up with new assignments. So for him it was kind of part of what he was doing anyway. He had the expertise to design the basic structure. He didn't want to teach the course. And this course has now had various iterations. It's grown into country-specific courses. So we've had a course for South Africa, UK, US. We're going to have Canada next, Australia. We now have courses specifically on Creative Commons, so not just copyright, but open licensing. So he kind of started this ball rolling. People got involved. They started running more courses, and so that's I think one approach to running the course. This is Jane. She studied creative writing in Berkeley, actually, and then took a job that kind of took her away from her writing career. And she always had in her mind that she wanted to go back and write again. And so she ran a course on creative nonfiction writing, which is a very unusual subject, apparently. And it was a way for her to kind of reconnect with her passion. That gave her some structure and made her kind of work through some examples and also work with other people and see, kind of look at their work, and kind of helped her come back to something she was interested in but wasn't quite sure if it was going to be a career for her at any point, but gave her a little bit of structure to come back. So I think we have lots of people at Peer-to-Peer University who fall in this category, who just have some expertise but really just want a reason to go back to something that they've started working on. So I think that's all kind of I want to say as a general introduction to how Peer-to-Peer University works and what it does and why people get involved. And then if we can obviously come back to any specifics. I want to just briefly talk about 4 issues that we've kind of been, I guess, thinking a lot about through this experience, just learning in the process. I mean, the one thing I didn't say, which I think is obvious, but that this has been just a huge experiment. When we started this, it was just a bunch of people who thought, well, let's see what happens. And then the response has been overwhelming, actually, at every stage. And it took on a life of its own in some way to kind of, now it has this momentum. It's been incorporated in California as a 501c3. There's some grant funding to keep it going. We're working with all these partners. And so I don't think a year ago, or maybe a year and a half ago, the people who started it were really sure that was going to happen. So there's been a lot of experimentation left and right, and we kind of, when the choice was between structure and experimentation, we've always gone with experimentation. And that's sometimes difficult for the user, but I think it's interesting for everyone else, because we also share everything that goes wrong. So there are 4 kind of areas where we've done a lot of thinking and kind of just trying to figure things out that I want to just briefly mention. One is learning, obviously. So there is this idea that a lot of the learning that is most useful or very useful today happens outside of institutions, where the institutions aren't really following the people to the places where they are learning. The web development is maybe kind of an extreme example, but I think the same is true in many other places where people form interest communities. They go back to things they were interested in many years after they formally studied them. They need to upskill to stay relevant in their work. And a lot of those things don't fit into the structures that we have created as institutions, or they're simply too expensive and people don't have access to them. So there is a kind of an aggressive attempt here to create new ways of lifelong peer learning. And what's been interesting for me to see is how much this has been driven by curiosity and kind of trying to solve problems. And I think that's inspiring for institutions, because the flip side of this, where you're trying to teach someone something and they're clearly not interested. It's just such a frustrating experience, and it's so hard to sometimes create that sense of curiosity. But it's amazing to see how much of that actually is out there, and how strong the demand is from people kind of to participate in these communities. So I think there's a lot of energy that can be harnessed by the institutions that kind of happens outside of institutions today. Secondly, we have a lot of questions around governance, because peer-to-peer university is almost entirely run by volunteers. There are some people who get paid, but the decision-making is extremely open and transparent. So even though I have the title of director, I have to be very careful what decisions I take and who I consult and how I communicate them, because at the end of the day, if I do too many things that the community doesn't like, there's no more project. I can't pay people to do peer-to-peer university. So it's kind of this give and take, right? The community does look for some level of leadership and people to do some things that the community doesn't want to do necessarily. But we have to be careful in how we involve the community in those discussions. And so I guess one kind of challenge is, how do you grow this, which is, like really the early stage community, to something like this, which is the Mozilla Summit, which is an annual gathering of the core Mozillians. And how do you still make decisions with people like this? Who I think you can see that they're quite they don't fall into the typical corporate hierarchical structure model. How do you harness these open communities in a way that you can still stay on track as a project? You don't get completely distracted, but you build these new kind of governance models as you go along. The next question is, and this always comes up. Well, how do you ensure quality? And usually people mean quality of courses. Like, how do you make sure that the courses that you have aren't horrible? And I think there are two approaches to quality on the web that we've seen. One is the Yahoo. I'm never sure how to pronounce it, but the left one, which is there's this mess, and we're going to categorize it so that for the user it becomes manageable. And then there's obviously the other approach, which is there's this mess. Great, we'll let it self-organize. We'll give the user some tools. They can make sense of it, but we don't try to categorize it. We don't try to hire people to categorize it. And so I think initially there has to be a transition from left to right here, because obviously as long as we have very few courses and we've only run them a few times, we don't have a lot of data that we can offer to the user. We can't tell them this course has run 3 times, everyone's dropped out every time, people really hated the experience. But as we have more courses and as we have a larger community, I think we will be able to shift that quality review from the kind of the entry point to the user. So I think at some point, peer-to-peer university is going to have thousands of courses, of which a good number are going to be absolutely crap. But we will be able to give the users the information about these courses that they need to not do them. So rather than me going through and saying, well, we're not going to do this course because it's crap, I'm going to tell the user, well, either this course has never run before, so have a look at the materials and see who's running it to make up your mind. Or I can say, this has run before, everyone dropped out, people said bad things about it. If you want to take it, great, but probably it's not going to be a great experience. So that's, I think our approach to quality is going to have to move to that level, but obviously that's completely different than the way that institutions deal with quality today, where you want to make sure that every course in your university is great. It doesn't always work, I mean, let's be honest. And the last point I think is certification, which is kind of really the nut that holds it all together, I think, at the moment. So peer-to-peer university offers no certification at this point, and we will never be an accredited university for obvious reasons. But at the same time, we want to make sure that the people who participate can have recognition for their achievements that is appropriate to what they want to do with it. So if I'm a web developer and I want to get a job, we are going to create some form of recognition for you that helps you get a job. If you want to take a refresher course before you enter a master's degree, we're going to try to help you transfer that what you've done in peer-to-peer university into the institution that you're applying to, so that they maybe give you credit, entry credit for that one course. And if you just want to do it because you want to do it and you want to put it on your blog that you've done this course, then we will help you. We will help you do that. So there are kind of two areas that falls into that we're experimenting with. One is actually with UCI, where we've been talking for a while. It's still very conceptual, but the idea would be that for continuing professional education credits, we would link kind of massive online courses where people self-organize and peer learn with assessments and certification that is handled at UCI. So the quality control kind of comes at the end. The institution makes sure that people have the skills that they need. But the learning, to some degree, is outsourced to the open web, and you let people handle that however that makes most sense to them. And then the second area, which is I think more, I guess, a little more experimental and kind of harder to get your head around, is well, how do we create complementary certification that makes sense on the web? And David mentioned badges, and that's kind of the term we've started using in general. And the idea is really, look, why shouldn't you be able to wear all of your achievements on some kind of, well, not a vest or anything, but online, obviously, but have some form of collecting them, organizing them, determining who you're going to show them to, but it's in your space, and those are all your achievements, and those achievements could be anything you've done that you care about. Could be, I've taught piano to my niece, and she's now a great pianist. Or it could be I studied law at Yale. Or whatever it is, the achievement that is valuable to you. If there's a way to recognize it, why shouldn't we give you the tools to kind of aggregate them and communicate them to other people? And online, that would obviously look a little bit different. And this is just a mock-up that we're working on with Mozilla, where we are actually building. So we're a little further along here than I might have made it sound. We're building an open infrastructure for badges, where any organization could become a badge issuer and publish badges into this infrastructure. And users would be in control. Their badges are tied to them through their ID that they use online, and they could control who gets to see those badges. They could move them to their blog. In the next stage, they could display them in LinkedIn or in Facebook. But the infrastructure that moves those badges around is completely open, and anyone could participate. And the validity of the badge really rests with the issuer. So the infrastructure doesn't put any requirements on the issuer in terms of how you issue those badges. And so peer-to-peer university would be one issuer for these badges. I think I'm at the end here, yeah. So I think, I don't know, that was kind of a huge amount of stuff that I tried to cover fairly quickly so we have time to discuss. But if any of it was not clear, it would be great if we, I'm happy to go back to any of these pieces and drill down into more detail. Yeah, I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you.
First, I want to say something about Philip. An extraordinary individual. He lives right in the center of the world. It's called South Africa, and he's almost everywhere all the time. I don't know how he does it. That's one thing. I think he mentioned UCI's involvement. I think the main thing I helped him with was to tell him about Ambien. Which he now uses on a regular basis. That probably keeps him.
Gave me one.
I gave him one. I got a peer-to-peer badge that said I could give you one. But he's incredible. He interacts with people with a coat and tie and gray hair falling out. But he also operates with people just as easily who have torn T-shirts and orange hair put into a mohawk. So he's it's extraordinary. The way he's put this whole thing together is extraordinary, and the people, the 4 or 5 or 6 people that really started with him are also extraordinary people. And he's given actually voice to what I just learned this last summer, something I hadn't heard about before, the edupunk. Anybody heard the word edupunk? Yes, a couple people. These are folks who not only do not want to go to a formal educational experience as offered by a university, but actually aggressively seek ways to go around it and do their own education. And peer-to-peer university is that sort of link between the structure and the non-structured world that really has to be made. And so peer-to-peer university is doing a great job of that, and is in a very experimental space. One of the things that peer-to-peer university is doing is something that happened that we found out in 2001 when we did our first Hewlett grant on learning repositories. Even in that early stage, we found out that the whole world of open courseware and open repositories was supply side oriented. That in fact users were not being consulted at all. People were putting up open courses and just doing whatever they wanted. And guess what? Nobody was using it because really the users had not been consulted. What's happened over these years is that we began to incorporate, first slowly and now more aggressively, the notion of users into the whole idea of the open world, the open educational world. And peer-to-peer university represents really an extension of that whole idea, that we want users to actually decide what they're going to learn and then go about learning it in a kind of a learning co-op. We have a sort of a learning co-op, but I see Peggy here. We have a sort of a learning co-op here at UCI called the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. That is a group of people who get together, decide what they want to learn, and then get the learning resource they need, and then get a lecture. Well, this is the same sort of thing, the same notion. Peer-to-peer university has got a version of that same notion, and it's really a learning co-op. From my perspective, from continuing education, again, we see this from a slightly different aspect than most people in universities do, because we've been serving people who are busy working adults who want their education in convenient forms. They don't want to have to drive on the freeway for 45 minutes each way if they can help it. They want it at whatever time they can get it, and so after their kids are in bed. So we've been trying to fulfill the notion of convenience in education. And also, our people are very sophisticated users of continuing education. They already have degrees, and so generally they know what they want. They want it in the most convenient and quickest way. They have an opportunity cost for all of their time. And so this notion of openness has also served our audience and our perspective. We have in higher education, for instance, frequently, we have already established a process by which learning can be validated by challenge tests, or even we can give credit for life experiences in some institutions. And this is the kind of notion of extending the learning, of redefining the learning space, not only to university level subjects and formal education, but well beyond those kinds of experience that we offer so prominently here at UCI. So we have it, peer-to-peer university is really in that same kind of tradition, although it also extends that tradition quite dramatically. Just one quick notion, the UCI Opencourseware site, and we have Adriana Maestas and Larry Cooperman, who are really the people who have been putting this together. We now, I would say, we are second only to MIT in terms of the institutional expression of Opencourseware. We are a distant second. They have 2,000 courses. We have maybe 52 or 55 courses. But we're getting there, and when you look at what other people are doing, as I say, I think we're a distant second. We now have about 30,000 visits a month to our courseware site. We have 52 courses up. We have over 70 videos up, and we're extending the idea of Opencourseware in many directions. one of which Philip mentioned, which is the notion of granting or doing a learning assessment in certain areas such as continuing professional education. This is where we're really excited about our partnership with Peer-to-Peer University. This is an experiment in a formal, well-established Research One university trying to make connections with the learners of the world who need the kind of services that we can provide from this university, which is validation of learning experiences, putting learning experiences into the proper context, that is the formal context that, as we recognize it, and for those who want it, giving them the certification that they need to fulfill their motives. And that's basically what continuing education really is all about. That's why we're doing it. But it's also wonderful to be in this same innovative space with these kind of cutting-edge, very experimental efforts, such as Peer-to-Peer University. We will be doing, as Philip said, we'll be doing some things with Peer-to-Peer University material, but we're also doing those same kind of things with material that have been produced by our own faculty through videotapes, through video lectures and so forth. We're beginning to get the notion of putting learning assessments inside video presentations, and then providing a certificate of completion or a certificate of learning to those folks who have taken that learning, seen that videotape, taken that learning test, and satisfied the learning requirements of the thing. So we're doing this and a few other things to try to serve in this experimental space that Philip has described. And so again, I want to close by really validating and really congratulating Philip on what he has done. Frankly, 2 years ago when I heard about P2PU, I thought this is a non-starter. This is not going to go anywhere. And I certainly thought about that as I began to see what was happening. But it's really been pulled together wonderfully, and more support has been coming through, and more money has been coming through, and so we're now very excited about seeing what happens next, and I'm pretty much convinced that this is going to live and continue to grow and prosper. We're very happy to be associated with it.
Thank you, Philip, for that introduction to P2PU. I spent some time over the weekend taking a look at the website and some of the courses and some of the material, and it was very helpful to get your framing just now. I'm kind of a curmudgeon, so I just want to say that right up front. And I'm also the sort of professor that generally doesn't allow my lectures to be videoed and posted for a bunch of reasons. I mean, one of the reasons I think is because for me, the classroom, even the large lecture hall, is really a dramaturgical space where I'm trying to get the students to do various things and think in certain ways, not just on a one-off kind of, here's today's lecture, I will now give you content, and then it starts again, but over the course of an extended conversation during a quarter. And it's very difficult for that kind of a thing to be excerpted on YouTube. So that's another sort of disclosure. And a few other disclosures as well. I'm sort of been thinking in the past couple of weeks about a couple of things that have been happening in the world. The Huffington Post deal, where free crowdsourced content all of a sudden became $300 million, not shared out to any of those folks. The peculiar kind of investment decisions around Facebook that are taking place, where we can have a kind of investor-driven capitalism, but the investment opportunities for Facebook are closed to JP Morgan and 30 special people. So it's not the kind of open model of anybody can be a shareholder. Anybody can be a shareholder of IBM or Intel, but not Facebook. And then finally, for my own particular kind of crankiness will show, in this weekend's redesign of the New York Times Magazine, where the letters section changed from being letters to being reply all. So just all of which is to say, you know, I appreciate the I appreciate the kind of experimental quality of what's being proposed here, but I want to try to push a bit and be a little bit provocative in my comments today here. And I should say another kind of, you know, in the interest of disclosure, both in the practical work that I do with the institute that I direct and in my research activity, I'm really, really, really committed to and interested in the idea of user-driven innovation and the kind of user-driven movement of various larger scale systems out there in the world, including education. But then I start to wonder at what point we can't equate scholarship with content, and we can't equate, say, being a professor with being a thought leader. So I've got kind of three big sort of things to say. The first is there virtue in things that are closed as opposed to open? What I'm thinking about is the way that there are very different notions of openness that are in this project and in a lot of projects like this that get kind of collapsed together. And I'm not entirely sure that that's always helpful. So we've got kind of the openness of open source and open code, openness in terms of access, openness in proprietary terms indexed by things like Creative Commons, and then openness in terms of decision-making and governance. We're using the same word for each one of those things. Each one of those things, I think, has very different work to do. Maybe works well with certain kinds of educational missions, maybe doesn't work so well with others. And I'm thinking about, when I sort of say, is there virtue in things that are closed? I'm thinking about how difficult it is to have this kind of conversation about this kind of experiment in such a heavily socially mediated context where even though kind of openness in the sense of provisionality is touted as a value, it's not really allowed, since if everything's open and everybody can tweet about this, I'm going to self-censor in ways that I wouldn't if I knew that this was a safe space of a closed classroom, outside of which we don't necessarily share, unless you've done the work, unless you've done the homework, unless you've done the readings, right? I don't want you dipping into my class, say, when I'm trying to get an evangelical student to take a pro-stem cell research position to test the limits of their thinking and their comfort zone. They're not going to be comfortable having that discussed outside, and I'm not going to be comfortable asking them to do that kind of activity if it is open in the sense of no walls. And this kind of makes me think about the history of the university and why there are walls. The history of things like the debate over academic freedom, which sets up walls to protect so that there can be crazy thinking going on here that doesn't offend the community with pitchforks, the donors, the government, the market, whatever. So, if everything is open, does this close down certain kinds of debate and discussion? And another way of asking it is, would this model work with the humanities and social sciences, where by definition our subject matter is highly controversial and highly charged, and gets us into trouble enough with the walls, so without the walls would we get into even more trouble? The next thing I wanted to raise is, and this gets to the kind of Huffington Post sort of thing, is how do we think about how this works in terms of a world structured by the market? And another way I could put this is, what kind of capitalism does this work with or against? And I think it works both with and against. I don't want to be, say it's all just, neoliberalism or something. But I want to think about that a bit. So we have this interesting kind of contradiction on the one hand of Chris Anderson's book Free and crowdsourcing and openness on the one hand, but then that's often paired with closed ownership structures on the other. Facebook is the example, right? From wearing a sort of hat of a government regulator, something like Facebook starts to look an awful lot like a public utility if it's being used for so many important functions, for communicative and other functions for people. If it's starting to appear to be a common carrier or a public utility, like the interstate road system or something like that, then how should we think about that kind of thing? Should perhaps ownership be open? And this gets to the whole question of sort of ownership and things like Creative Commons licensing and how awkwardly they sit in the current moment with the kind of market structures that we live in. To say nothing of the university's place within those sorts of market structures. So that's my kind of, what kind of capitalism is peer-to-peer university adequate to? And then the last thing I want to raise here has to do with, in a way, the branding here by using the term university. And what kind of value added does the notion of university still have? That's really intriguing to me, and I think potentially quite interesting if this experiment can be used to push some of the boundaries of that brand, so to speak, in new directions toward various forms of user innovation without tearing down all the walls or eliminating all of the ownership. I'm interested, too, with this link to the notion of the university. And the university, to me, I have this very old-fashioned kind of sense of the university being about kind of universal knowledge, right? And this sort of, the university is this sort of big thing where even sort of arcane knowledge can exist and even impractical knowledge can exist. There's an interesting thing here, too, for me with the notion of peer, because we've also got at least two very different notions of peer going on in academia and in some of these digitally mediated learning spaces. Peer in the sense of peer-to-peer as, on the one hand, kind of all of us, anybody, right? The sort of collaborative, kind of sharing kind of world. But then the peer in peer review, which is the hallmark of an academic discussion, isn't really like that, right? The peers in peer reviews they're a kind of community of equals, but not really. There is hierarchy. There's often anonymity or confidentiality, so your work is reviewed by a group of your peers, but you don't get to know who they are. And with a good peer review system, they don't get to know who you are either. And that's the kind of system that creates our equivalent of badges, so to speak, that authorizes the kind of knowledge that we produce. Again, even if that knowledge is impractical, arcane, of no current relevance, we still have this process of peer review to say we may not, the market, the government, whoever, may not care one whit for, name something in the humanities that they want to get rid of, right? Just fill in the blank, medieval French literature, sorry. Right? But here we pull together the peers in that field, or who can speak to it in an intelligent way, and they've given it their kind of warrant. It's interesting that and this is more of a sort of question, it's interesting that in P2PU that the U is there, and I want to know what kind of badging work that U does in this kind of experiment. And do you need it? Do you not need it? What does it do? Could it really be a university in the sense of universal knowledge, where again even the arcane is allowed in? So again, I say this as a sort of friendly provocation, but these are the sort of things that have been bugging me lately, and this provides me an occasion to think about those things a bit more deeply through this really quite fascinating experiment.